Could Prince Andrew be forced to give up his 30-bedroom mansion known as Royal Lodge? It comes after the revelation that he pays a token amount of rent every year in return for having paid millions of pounds to refurbish it when he first moved in. We'll discuss what's going on in this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly I'll be joined by my colleagues who've spent hours watching Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, at the COVID inquiry, where he was asked questions about his decision-making about children and young people and schools during the pandemic. But first of all, the questions have continued for Prince Andrew today, as we're recording this episode of Newscast on Tuesday evening, and a lot of them are around his living arrangements and where he lives, the Royal Lodge, the 30-bedroom mansion in Windsor Great Park, because some details have emerged of the lease that he has for that property. Also continuing, the political criticism, which is taking lots of different forms and coming from new places all the time. The person who's been watching it all unfold throughout Tuesday is our politics and investigations correspondent, Joe Pike, and I spoke to him in the other studio a little bit earlier on. Well, let's speak now to Joe Pike, who's our politics and investigations correspondent. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Adam.
You've actually been covering this all weekend, haven't you?
I have, yes, a lot of it.
So where have we got to today? Where should we start?
I think we probably should start with Royal Lodge, this revelation from the Times newspaper, which actually was in some government documents a couple of decades ago, but it's still significant that Prince Andrew is living in Royal Lodge, this 30-room Grade 2 listed mansion in Windsor Great Park for peppercorn rent, so effectively paying nothing for it. That has prompted quite a significant political reaction, but we should probably point out he did pay up front £7.5 million to refurbish this property. It's in the midst of Windsor Great Park. It has the Royal Chapel in its grounds. There are always security concerns about leasing it to somebody else because it's listed. You couldn't exactly turn it into a hotel. And certainly a couple of decades ago, the National Audit Office looked into this arrangement, a lease between the then Duke of York, Prince Andrew, and the Crown Estate, which is a sort of big national property company looking after the sovereign's public wealth. And the National Audit Office said that actually this arrangement was value for money and that effectively the public purse got its money's worth from the fact that Prince Andrew had spent many millions refurbishing it. And of course, he pays for its upkeep very regularly too.
So the idea being that paying for it to be refurbished and a bit on top was kind of in lieu of, 50 years worth of rent.
Exactly, and it's very difficult to rent it out. And certainly the lease does say, for example, that he needs to ensure the exterior stonework is in a good condition every 5 years. He needs to paint the interior every 7 years. He needs to allow his landlords to inspect it, making sure he's keeping up the lease. Unclear whether they have been inspecting it. Also interesting, Adam, no helicopters and no gambling on the premises.
Well, I mean, we all have conditions in our leases for our properties, don't we? I'm not sure if there's a helicopter clause in mine. And I suppose what is eye-opening about this is even though some of this information, or maybe all of it in various forms, was in the public domain, what was kind of in the public domain in people's minds was that he was paying about £200,000 a year of rent.
Yeah, and I suppose if you take a step back, we thought this man had lost his royal role. He was no longer a working royal. He's not allowed to use his titles. And yet he is living in this pretty palatial home, seemingly sort of at the taxpayer's expense. As I've explained, it's not quite as simple as that. But certainly the lifestyle he is currently being allowed to have on a property that is owned effectively by all of us has raised a lot of eyebrows and led to, I think, quite a significant shift in the political reaction, because normally politicians don't get involved at all in royal matters. But in recent days, Adam, we've seen a bit of a shift there.
Oh, yeah. And Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has just been talking at an investment summit, hasn't she?
She has, and she spoke
obviously not about this, but she then was asked about this.
Yeah, she spoke to one of our colleagues from BBC Midlands today, and I think what was not surprising is that she followed what other government ministers have done in recent days, which is to effectively swerve the issue. She certainly did not want to comment on the sort of Royal Lodge matter, saying she's not seen the details, I can't comment on them, I just don't know the details. But she was asked about Prince Andrew in the context of Virginia Giuffre's book. Virginia Giuffre being the most prominent of Jeffrey Epstein's accusers, who ended her own life in April of this year, and who today, Tuesday, her memoir was published, some new information in that. And Rachel Reeves said, I think, that the most striking line, she said, Prince Andrew shouldn't have been associated with a convicted paedophile. Now, that may not be surprising that that's her view, Adam. However, it is a step away from what other government ministers have been doing in recent days, which is to completely swerve the issue and say all of this is a matter for Buckingham Palace.
And here is how Rachel Reeves said that.
He shouldn't have been associated with a convicted paedophile, and I think the new revelations in this book, make for very sober reading, and I'm sure that everybody will reflect on that and form their own judgment.
And then let's get some other reaction. Here's Robert Jenrick using some quite strong language on BBC Breakfast.
He has behaved disgracefully. He's embarrassed the royal family time and again. He should really now leave public life forever, stop having any subsidy from the taxpayer whatsoever, and go and lead an entirely private life. The public are sick of Prince Andrew.
Okay, Joe, what's your take on that? I don't mean he used strong language like swearing, but strong language in terms of his opinion about what should happen.
What jumped out at me, Adam, behaved disgracefully, embarrassed the royal family, the public are sick of him, and also that push, though it's not quite clear what he means by it, for Prince Andrew to stop having any subsidy from the taxpayer. Does he mean move out of Royal Lodge? It is unclear. But the Conservative Party, as their name would suggest, don't normally speak about the royal family, certainly not criticise a member of it. That is absolutely not what Robert Jenrick is doing today, although I've spoken to some of Kemi Badenoch's team, and they're very clear that the party's position is that this is a matter for the royal family. Added to that, a couple of days ago, the SNP's leader in Westminster, Stephen Flynn, called for Prince Andrew's titles, his dukedom, to be legally removed. He may have sort of set them aside and agreed last Friday he won't use them, but they are given to him and exist in law, and therefore it would require law, although not much law, to officially remove them. The SNP are calling from that, and also very strong language from the Liberal Democrats too. This is a statement rather than a clip, but their Cabinet Office spokesperson has said Prince Andrew has failed our king and royal family and betrayed the values of the British people. The longer this whole saga goes on, the more his presence in public life is an insult and increasingly an embarrassment. And here's the key thing about Royal Lodge. He should show some contrition by returning every penny of rent that he's not paid while disgracing his office. I'm not quite sure what they're calling for there, Adam. Are they calling for sort of back rent for the last...
how do you return something you've not paid?
Exactly.
Yeah,
that seems like something that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But interesting, you've got two opposition politicians, one the party of the Lib Dems and then a prominent Conservative, Robert Jenrick, calling for a shift in the Royal Lodge situation.
I'm not sure this moves us on from the situation we were in yesterday, where it would require quite a big heave by opponents of Prince Andrew to force the government into doing something.
I agree. I think all of this, as ever, comes down to ultimately the King deciding, Buckingham Palace deciding something needs to happen, and that being agreed with the Prime Minister. Of course, we never hear about those private conversations between Prime Ministers and monarchs, but it seems certainly unlikely the government will do anything. That doesn't, though, mean there isn't something really striking and unusual about suddenly, over a matter of days, prominent opposition politicians being vocally, strikingly critical of a member of the royal family. That is pretty new, especially, I think, with the Lib Dems when you consider how positive Sir Ed Davey, the leader of that party, is about the King. And I think even if this doesn't change things, it will have been heard in Buckingham Palace. And of course, the question the palace are constantly facing is, how do we finally draw a line under this? And certainly they've struggled to do that over a number of years.
Well, yeah, because every time they draw a line, it turns out there's a new line.
Absolutely. And also, even though Prince Andrew has lost a lot, including his royal position and his patronages and his military titles, in law he is still the Duke of York. He is still a prince. That could all change, and certainly constitutional experts have slightly gone against what palace sources seem to be saying. That it wouldn't be very difficult for Parliament to change that, to make sort of amendments in law, because so much of this is in legislation, and legislation from many decades ago. So it could be done quite quickly without much debate, because certainly MPs by convention are not really allowed to discuss the royal family in the House of Commons. There doesn't seem any sign that it's happening yet, but I suppose it could happen quickly, and it depends whether others feel that they are emboldened after these interventions over the last 2 or 3 days.
I can totally imagine either like an old-timer backbencher who's always hated this convention and also doesn't think it's quite as strong a convention as other people do, mentioning this at PMQs tomorrow to get maximum publicity, or maybe a new generation MP who just thinks it's all really old-fashioned.
Absolutely. I think that is very, very possible. I was trying to work out in my head whether Kemi Badenoch would want to talk about this as one of her 6 questions on Wednesday. I think that's probably unlikely, certainly.
If the Conservative Party official statement is kind of shutting down Robert Jenrick, that suggests no.
Exactly. That was my thought. But I think you're right that others could voice it. And partly, I suppose, what this comes down to is that even though partly this is about royalty and the monarchy, it is also, even though Prince Andrew, of course, has consistently denied all these allegations, about victims and survivors. And certainly one thing that government ministers have said, and other opposition parties have said in recent days, is that we need to think about survivors and victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And ultimately, I suppose, this whole row over Prince Andrew over many years does come back to the question over the company you keep. And even though he is denied wrongdoing, we do know that 2 of his close friends for quite a long time are people we now know to be a prolific convicted paedophile and also a convicted sex trafficker.
Also, I think one of the really interesting things that has emerged today was Baroness Kennedy, Helena Kennedy, Labour peer, on the Today programme at about 8:20, floating this idea of Andrew moving to Switzerland and sort of insinuating that maybe that might be the king's preferred option for this. And okay, that sounds quite speculative. And of course, people have said, oh, in the past, royals have gone and lived in other countries when they've proved to be a big problem. But what I think is interesting about that is she, I think, is quite pally with the king. And also, she set up the chambers that Keir Starmer was a barrister in. So that reflects a certain kind of stratum of opinion about what should happen to Prince Andrew, which I think is fascinating that she sort of put that out there in the open.
That is absolutely fascinating. And I suppose the most prominent historical example would be the Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, who, of course, abdicated so he could be with a woman he loved. Certainly the story of his life after he was king is pretty sort of sad, depressing, controversial at points. But clearly the monarchy do not want, and it's been reported for quite a long time, they do not want Andrew in this mansion, Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. I suppose the danger with him really being sort of outside the tent is that can cause problems too. Now, it would be strange to think that he would pursue sort of media interventions like Prince Harry has, but certainly I think there are advantages, and maybe this is felt partly in royal circles, I have sort of no evidence of it, of keeping somebody like Prince Andrew close at hand. Partly so you know what he's getting up to, but also there is an element that the royal family seem to have great fondness for his 2 daughters and their continuing role.
Joe, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
Now, as promised, we're going back down memory lane because that's what the COVID inquiry were doing today when they were quizzing Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, for several hours for their 8th module of their inquiry, which is all about how government decision-making affected children and young people, with a big focus on the decisions in 2020 and 2021 to close schools for quite long periods of time. Two of my ace colleagues have been watching all his hours of testimony, and they're here in the Newscast studio. Please welcome Education Editor Branwen Jeffries. Hi, Branwen.
Hello.
And Ben Chu from BBC Verify. Hello.
Hello, Adam.
First of all, before we dig into the evidence, how did it feel for you guys watching it? Because I used to love talking about COVID and government policy and the ins and outs of it. I'm not sure I love it quite so much now.
Do you know, I lived and breathed it
Yeah.
at the time because I was on the phone or on people's doorsteps or in schools and colleges the whole time. So it was an extraordinary day to see it now being unpicked. And I think there's a real generational piece here. When you talk to anyone who's under 25, 26, it came at such a big time in their life. Absolutely massive points of transition, not just in education, but in their social development, their friendships. And it still really matters.
Yeah. And Ben, it's interesting going from the days where we knew all the decisions and the dates and the documents that were floating around almost like the backs of our hands. And now it feels like ancient history.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of us have tried to blot out that period because it was so traumatic in many ways. I mean, my biggest memory today watching the evidence was actually homeschooling in that period in March and April in 2020. And I had two primary school age children, just trying to find the laptops, trying to navigate the teaching aids. It was very, very stressful, and obviously trying to do your job at the same time. So very big consequences of those decisions made at that time. And I lived through it and I felt it. And, we were relatively privileged because we had a laptop, two laptops knocking about the house. Imagine if you didn't. Imagine trying to do it on a phone or without broadband. I mean, it was a very, very tough time.
And Branwen, just in terms of the processology, this is module 8 of the COVID inquiry, and its focus is entirely on the stuff we've just been talking about there.
That's exactly it. It focuses on what happened to anyone who was under 18 at the time. So children from the smallest babies to young adults, effectively. And it concludes its evidence at the end of this week. This was probably Boris Johnson's last appearance at the inquiry, so very significant. He was there today.
Which is his second overall.
His second overall. And we may not get the report from this module until some way through next year because they're publishing them bit by bit.
Lots to discuss. Let's listen to an early bit of Boris Johnson's evidence where he's being asked by the KC about the initial decision to shut schools in mid-March 2020.
School closures were clearly going to be part of the panoply of things that we might be able to do to defeat COVID. I wanted to keep it to the very, very last. It was something that I thought was a terrible thing to do, and it would have awful consequences for young people, particularly those who were least able to cope.
Yeah, Ben, just give us a bit of your take on that, what he was saying there.
Well, there was this dispute which was arisen out of previous evidence we heard from Gavin Williamson about how much preparation there was and evidence from the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education about there not being any contingency plans for schools closing. And it's worth just underlining why this is really important, because there was a big impact, as we've been discussing, about these shutdowns on children. Maybe they should have done it, maybe they shouldn't. But if you were going to do it, you'd want the government to be prepared in some way to make this as painless as possible. But
because
if there was
the decision is quite a sort of, I'm not going to say easy decision, but it's like shut them or not. But it's then all the consequences that come from that you have to then mitigate. Or
exactly. So things like we were talking about laptops. Have you got laptops ready? Have you got a plan for vulnerable children? Have you got a plan for children who need to go to school to eat properly? All these things. But it looks like, according to the evidence from Gavin Williamson and the Department for Education Permanent Secretary, that there had been none of that planning. So Boris Johnson was challenged on this today, and he said he didn't really recognise that. He said, well, they were talking about shutting the schools, and as far as I was concerned, they were making plans. So there was a very direct contradiction between what we'd heard from the department, the Education Department, and what we heard from Boris Johnson today. So we at Verify looked at these evidence. I think as Boris Johnson said, he is right that SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Council, did discuss school closures, and it was clearly being discussed within government as a possibility. But that's not the same as contingency planning, so they can both be true at the same time. According to the people who were actually in charge operationally of schools, there was no contingency planning, and we heard nothing today to really say that that wasn't true.
And it was very clear that in as much as they were thinking about it, they were thinking, well, what happens to an individual school if half the teachers are ill and we have to somehow keep the education going for everyone else? There wasn't any large-scale planning for what happened if you closed all the schools for most of the children all at the same time. And in fact, what was surfaced today, and they showed some of it at the inquiry, was a hasty 3-pager which was drawn up on the day before it was announced to parents. And in that, there were some interesting details. It was clear they understood that if you took free school meals away, they couldn't begin to get food vouchers, for example, to children for a month. There was no mention at all of vulnerable children and how to look after them.
Although I saw a memo that they flashed up on the screen, there was some bullet points from the Department for Education around that period that spelt out very clearly all the consequences that we then all lived through. And I was like, oh, actually, there were some people very aware of where this would lead.
That was from March the 17th, 2020. Yeah. The announcement was made on March the 18th, 2020. We heard in previous evidence from Gavin Williamson that an email arrived at 8:45 p.m. saying, right, OK, we've decided we are going to shut schools. And officials worked through the night to try and pull things together. So for something that's that large scale, affecting 9 million children, it's not 3 pages does not go a long way.
And not trying to prejudge the outcome of the inquiry, but having read the previous report from the inquiry and watched hours of the interrogation of other ministers and other subjects, you can see there's 2 things that the inquiry just keep pushing at and highlighting, which is the sort of the failure of imagination. Like you can't, if you're not prepared, if you're not thinking about the worst, you can't really prepare for the worst. And then also just the Whitehall decision making, who was actually in charge and what sort of assumptions were made about who else might be doing something if the Prime Minister isn't directly saying, right, we're doing this now, plan for this tomorrow.
And an extraordinarily massive sort of don't think culture in some ways. So if the message from the centre is, well, this is a remote possibility, that a department wouldn't then galvanise itself to think, well, it might happen, so we need to have a plan just in case.
I think it is worth making the point that it is still disputed very vigorously about whether it was right or wrong to shut the schools, in fact, in terms of dealing with the virus. And people can have legitimate views on both sides of that. But I think,
including Boris Johnson, who holds both positions.
He changed his mind.
Yeah.
He was very conflicted. You could see that. But the issue is, you should still plan for it. If it's a serious possibility, even if you don't want to do it, why isn't government, why isn't the Department for Education, why isn't Downing Street getting a plan together? So if you do have to do what you don't want to do, or you hope you won't have to do, to get ready for it. And I think that's where I suspect the inquiry will find criticism.
And there's one thing for everyone to hold in mind, which is virtually the whole world closed schools in that spring of 2020.
And before the UK did.
And before the UK did. So, places like Italy could have been a warning signal for the UK, but also it wasn't a decision that looked irrational to many governments in that context at that time.
And then if we fast forward to the second school closure decision, which was at the very beginning of January 2021, I mean, the decision making around that seems, well, we know at the time, it was very ragged. The schools opened and then closed the next day.
I have such a vivid memory of being in a primary school in Warrington. Parents really relieved in many ways that their kids could come back and see their friends and their teachers. And then sitting in a van outside that same school, watching the Prime Minister say, actually, we've decided we have to close them and we're cancelling exams again. And we heard today about a key meeting that had happened during that day in which they'd looked at the data around the new variant, the Alpha variant, and he said it was that scientific data which had convinced them that although they wanted to open schools, they couldn't.
But up to that, the conversation in government had been about what level of testing do you have and what kind of staggering of different year groups do you have going back. They weren't talking about, bring all the children home again.
Yeah, well, I remember being on the other side of it at the school gate, dropping your children off, thinking we're out of this, thank God, and then being pulled back into this. It was an incredibly tough time. I think that was probably one of the bleakest moments, actually, that January 2021, given the surging number of deaths and that sense of we're going back into this again. And the government, it felt to many parents that they just didn't have a grip on what was going on. The fact that you were in and out like that just doesn't breed confidence.
And I mean, I didn't watch Gavin Williamson's evidence when he was giving it a few days ago, but the KC was referring to it in the questioning of Boris Johnson today. And she said, he sort of suggests that actually the decision to close schools in 2021 wasn't really necessarily about schools. It was more about getting everyone in the population to follow all the rules. And if you wanted to do that, maybe you would say, we're even shutting the schools. That's why we're shutting everything else. You've got to follow, we're throwing everything at this. It was almost like part of the inquiry didn't use this word, but it was almost like a sort of propaganda thing to encourage behaviour elsewhere.
The word messaging was used by Gavin Williamson, that's what he thought it was largely about, and that this metaphor had been used about smashing a Ming vase on the floor just to get the point across, and that was the closure of schools. Today, Boris Johnson was pretty emphatic that it wasn't just about that. They were genuinely concerned about the spread of the virus and the virus going back into households and what that would mean.
And then, Branwen, you alluded to the exams fiasco, and I think we can call it a fiasco. Everyone widely calls it that now. In summer 2020, when there was the infamous algorithm that was deciding pupils' grades for them, what did Boris Johnson say about that?
So he said that it was a bad decision, that they should have known sooner, they shouldn't have implemented it, and that the public outrage was absolutely huge, and he fully acknowledged that. What I was really struck by was, if you reel back to 2020, at the time, he was calling it a mutant algorithm, suggesting that it somehow had a mind of its own and had gone off and concocted these exam results. What we've heard over the last couple of weeks is that there were warnings from senior school leaders as earlier as April saying, look, this doesn't look as though it's going to be terribly fair for a lot of students. Are you really sure about this? And that there was a doubling down because they wanted to make sure that there wasn't grade inflation. What was read out in the inquiry today was a message from Boris Johnson at the time to Dominic Cummings, basically saying, and I'm paraphrasing this politely.
No, I'm going to read it out because I did a screen grab of it, because that's what I like to do when Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages appear on the big screen. I'll not use the first few words because it involves a swear word, but he's talking about a newspaper reporting this situation, which has messed up. Quote, the remnants of my Scottish break. So I'm back in Chequers and in a thoroughly homicidal mood. We need a plan for the Department of Education. We need a permanent secretary, in other words, the most senior civil servant, and we need better ministers. And quite frankly, we need an agenda of reform. We can't go on like this. I'm thinking of going into number 10 and firing people. That's the message.
And note the people multiple, because some people today have said, was that him intending to sack Gavin Williamson? Also heavily involved in the exams decisions at the time was Nick Gibb, who was a very experienced schools minister, very concerned about standards, and he had been involved in a lot of the nitty-gritty. In the end, neither of the politicians walked the plank. It was the permanent secretary, the most senior civil servant, Jonathan Slater, who was made to leave and to fall on his sword to take off some of the heat from the public outcry around this.
And also there was an interesting memo on the screen in the room from Helen McNamara, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, who's been quite prominent in all of this. And she was sort of starting to ask the questions about why the algorithm had gone wrong, saying things like, when was it decided that grade inflation prevention was the main thing here? Because if you decided something else, you would have gone down a different route.
I think that's really important. So Boris Johnson, in his testimony, said, well, he got quite indignant right at the end, saying, well, you try and devise a way of being fair to all pupils and keeping
that was his
up.
angriest moment.
And that is true. It is very hard to do that, given you weren't sitting exams, to devise a system. The real question is, did they privilege not stopping grade inflation over fairness? And why was that decision taken? Who took it? And who was responsible for to carry the can for that? They didn't quite get to that for me. Boris Johnson was apologetic. He said, look, he admitted it was a fiasco, and obviously they had to completely scrap the system that they devised in very short order. But it seems to me that the really important political point is who had made that decision and why, because that was the source of it, actually. If they'd gone for the system, the centrally assessed grades, first of all, they could have avoided all this, but they chose not to. Someone was saying the most important priority for government is to stop grade inflation, and a lot of people would question whether they had their priorities right.
And across the UK, it's worth remembering there are 4 exams regulators. They all broadly use the same algorithm. Because Scottish results come out a week earlier, Nicola Sturgeon had called it pretty quickly and said, OK, we're going to U-turn on this. It hasn't worked. It's clearly not fair. The A-level results in England were a week later, and it took days and protests and people pointing out that if you've got a system which, even if it's only unfair, and only perhaps is the wrong word, for a minority of students, for each of their students, it's 100% of their future.
Yeah.
So if you have gone through school getting largely A's and B's or the equivalent, and you get to A-levels, and because the algorithm, because you're doing a large subject with lots of people taking it, you get a D or an E, you are not happy.
Yeah. And also that Helen McNamara email, it's quite interesting just seeing the language that is used towards the Prime Minister of like, you will want to decide to do something like X. Please let us know if you want some options of X, Y, and Z while we suggest you do X. So it's just amazing getting the insight into just how these things are done. Branwen, anything else that we haven't covered yet?
I think the other thing really was around what should happen once they recognise that there'd been a huge impact on schools and kids' education. What should happen afterwards? There was a lot of discussion about Sir Kevin Collins, an education expert, who was appointed as recovery czar by Boris Johnson with great fanfare. And
who wanted to spend £15 billion.
He wanted to spend £15 billion, and his grand vision was to make school super attractive by extending the school day and putting in sports, arts, creative subjects, drama, stuff that would get kids back into school, which arguably, sitting where we are now, where we know that attendance is still not fully recovered, might have been a smart idea. What Boris Johnson said today was, yes, I let him come up with a grand plan, and then I had to make difficult decisions about how much we were spending on COVID recovery across the whole of the UK in different parts of the economy. And it just felt like 10 billion too much. So we gave him 5 billion for tutoring, for which there was a solid evidence base.
I think it's right interesting that, because Boris Johnson said he stood by that decision. He said, I don't think it would have been value for money to spend as much as Kevin Collins was recommending. A lot of education experts at the time, I remember, were saying, actually, this is a bit of a false economy. There's a study by the Institute for Fiscal Studies which suggested at that time that not fully helping these children catch up could cost the British economy in the long term some £350 billion. So if you put the 15 billion catch up in that context, it does look a bit like a false economy not to spend it. Now, I think we're still going to have to wait for the evaluations to find out exactly whether the Prime Minister was right or Kevin Collins was right, who still sticks to that view. But I think it is worth putting it in that context. The lifelong damage to people's education and therefore their earning ability needs to be weighed in that.
And also just think about it politically. There's a parallel universe where they spent the money, schools were completely revolutionised after this dreadful period, and Boris Johnson's legacy was reinventing education from the ashes of this disaster. But instead, his legacy is, well, the legacy that he has.
And tutoring did make a difference. It's worth saying that. There is evidence that it did help children catch up with lost learning. But that's really to think about children in a very narrow way, which is all about school and knowledge and getting them through exams, rather than thinking about their emotional well-being, their social development, their ability to communicate and connect with other people, all of which suffered hugely. And we've seen a spike in mental health referrals for the most serious cases coming out of the COVID. We hear anecdotally about the lack of social skills and social confidence. It's huge. And of course, that's hard to quantify, so hard to make the case to Treasury.
Branwen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Ben, thanks to you too.
Thank you, Adam.
And around this time last week, we were doing an episode of Newscast and we got some breaking news from Washington, D.C. that following a phone call between the two of them, Donald Trump was preparing to meet Vladimir Putin face-to-face in Hungary to talk about the fate of Ukraine. We now hear from the White House today on Tuesday, there are now no plans for the two men to meet. So we will keep an eye on whether there's any outcome or consequences from that decision. And that's it for this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.